This is part 1 of 3 of the Full APES Year in Review, or 2013, the year everyone gets a 5. Okay, so this PowerPoint is going to go through chapter by chapter. It's an older version of the book, though, and so don't worry too much about the chapter numbers. Some of them have been switched around, and if I remember, I'll tell you. But this is a very good look at the basics in each of the sections that we have covered. So chapter 1 is really an introduction to environmental science. So we learn that what we will be doing in the course is looking at how natural world works, understanding human systems and their interactions, determining environmental problems, and hopefully to come up with solutions for a sustainable relationship. And that's something that hopefully you noticed as we went through the book, is that there were always problems and solutions. What is going on and what can we do to fix it? And so that was the goal of the entire course, really. One of the first things that we had you look at was the case study of Easter Island. And Easter Island was used as a metaphor for the Earth, being that we are isolated in an immense space and there is no escaping our surroundings. We have to treat what we have well. And so again, the story of Easter Island, you had a tribal population there with a very lush surroundings, very good natural resources. But what they did was to cut down all of the trees, whether it was for fuel wood, whether it was for the palm hearts, which some people eat, or more importantly, to move those statues that served a very important cultural purpose for the islanders. And so fairly soon, they had decimated the entire forest system, and with that came major changes to the water cycle, where water was no longer able to percolate down into the soil because the runoff was too fast. And so you ended up having a shortage of water, which led to a shortage of food, which led to warfare, cannibalism, all sorts of other things that began to happen on the island. And so we come up then with this idea that in order to be truly sustainable, we have to allow the planet to continue to supply us with resources without sacrificing future generations. And that also goes along with the idea of stewardship, caring for something that doesn't belong to you. And the way that environmentalists go about all this is using the scientific method. Now, it is very different than other subjects because aside from Hubbard Brook, if you remember that experiment, if you don't, look it up, but aside from Hubbard Brook, we cannot create large-scale ecosystem scientific experiments. There's too much variability in nature. And so that's one of the reasons why environmental science can get attacked as not being sound science. But we use modeling, we use examples from history, and we use the best data that is available to us. But again, you're dealing with whole world, whole ecosystem issues. It's very difficult to create a controlled study. Okay, we also looked at in chapter 1 the basics for human population growth. And remember that what we saw in that first graph was the exponential growth of the population. Also try to remember back to that dots video where the dots kept appearing, and by the end of the video, the dots again representing 1,000,000 people, by the end of the video the dots were popping up so fast and spreading over so much of the continents that it really looked like humans were a plague on the earth. The reason why we're so concerned with population, and again, this is a little bit of an older PowerPoint, so we now have more than 7 billion people, but the reason why we're so concerned with this is that every increase in population leads to an increase in resource demand, and those resources are the things that we've been talking about. They're the food, they're the water, they're the energy. It's all going to lead to excess pollution, excess habitat loss, and so every single problem in environmental studies comes back to population because it is the human population that we're concerned with. We can't change the actions of other species, but we can educate our actions and hopefully change those. So the numbers are a little bit old. We didn't reach 7 billion until 2011, so a couple years off, which shows you that we're slowing from when this graph was made. And it was, I believe, 1999. Yeah, if you look at that, it becomes dotted after that. So in 99, we reached 6 billion, but it took us a little bit longer to get to 7 billion. But they're still predicting that by about 2050, we will be at 10 billion people. And you can see that that would be a conservative estimate based on their graph. So again, the increase in population is an increase for resources. Soil degradation is another topic that came up, especially because we need food. And we started talking in the year about Thomas Malthus and how he said that we would overshoot our food production because human population growth grew exponentially, but food was growing linearly. And so food becomes a huge issue all throughout the course. Now, our demand for food has led to some bad farming practices that have led to erosion, remember the Dust Bowl. Minerals in the soil become depleted as they get used up by the plant, also as over-irrigation tends to wash those down into the lower layers of the soil. And so those minerals being depleted has a large impact on the entire food chain. And if we're talking about crops, that would be us. We're not feeding our crops to a lot of other animals, except for the corn going to the fish and the cows and everybody else that we can give corn to. But the minerals are being lost, and so that has a large effect on your health, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those minerals later on. Salinization, that's the over saltiness of the soil that has come from irrigation water. If you are not using rainwater, which you learn in chemistry, you can purify by distillation, but if you're not using that purified rainwater, then you're going to be using either surface water or groundwater. And as that flows over the ground or flows through the ground and percolates into it, it picks up trace minerals. And one of those is going to be any of your salt compounds, NaCl, CaCl, all of those. And now what happens then is you water your soil with it, and the water evaporates because we don't have very effective techniques of irrigation, and it leaves behind those salts. And what happens over time then is more and more salt builds up on top of the soil. A solution some farmers try is to pour excess water on it, but that leads to water logging, where you've essentially drowned out the roots of the plant. So salinization is a huge issue, and it comes from using groundwater, using surface water, whatever we've got available that's not provided by the water cycle in that ecosystem. We've also increased the use of pesticides, and when we talk about toxicology, that comes up quite a bit. Things like biomagnification, looking at Rachel Carson and the impact she had on society. And again, we overuse our fresh water. Global atmospheric change, here I want to really focus on this idea. And listen up. Global warming is not related to ozone depletion. Even still in the course, we keep seeing people answer questions and they're relating CO2 to the hole in the ozone layer, or they're relating the hole in the ozone layer to the warming of the earth. It is not the same thing. I want you to put them in separate pockets of your mind. Here's how we do that. Global warming is occurring down in the troposphere. It is a problem for the temperatures that we experience, because remember that weather occurs in the troposphere. So what you've got is, again, the greenhouse gases, we'll bring those up later. The greenhouse gases get warm, and then by extension, the atmosphere around us gets warm. Nitrogen and oxygen don't get warm. So that leaves just a few different compounds that get substantially warmer than they should when they are heated up by the sun. One of the most potent is water vapor, but we don't do anything truly to change the amount of water vapor in the air. Even if we boil water, it's going to turn into condensation and come back down relatively quickly. But what we have done is we have increased the amount of CO2, because the carbon dioxide we're talking about used to be sequestered or held inside of the earth. And so when we pump out those fossil fuels, we're releasing carbon that has been put away for millions and millions of years. And it was in plant form even back then, so it wasn't atmospheric. And so we do become concerned with global warming because of fossil fuel burning. So yeah, there are other gases, but we are having the most profound effect on levels of CO2 as far as it relates to temperature. Now, normally, the plants are going to be the ones taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere in photosynthesis, and you've got the equation down there below if you don't remember it from your biology class. But what's important to note is that this is also then where the other organisms are going to get their carbons, is we are going to eat the plants, and so we take in carbon. And we'll see a chart in a minute about the other major cycles, and you'll see why that's important to remember. It's glucose or carbohydrates are giving us our carbon. Ozone depletion, again, a completely separate topic. Ozone depletion is going on in the stratosphere, so one layer up. The way that I remember that they don't have anything to do with each other is that the ozone protects us from UV rays. The ozone then protects us from sunburns. But I can get sunburn on a cold day. So the ozone layer being depleted has nothing to do with whether it's hot or cold. You go skiing, you get a sunburn. Okay, so again, we can get UV radiation no matter what the temperature is. The stratosphere is not doing anything to make us hot down here. We don't live in the stratosphere. Instead, what we should think of the stratosphere as providing is a shield from UV radiation. And if you remember your electromagnetic spectrum from chemistry, you'll remember that UV radiation is above the visible light spectrum and just below things like X-rays. And so we know that they are very powerful, lots of energy because of that intense frequency. And what we know about the ozone layer is that it gives us protection from most of the UVB rays, all of the UVC rays. A lot of the UVA come through, but again, remembering that electromagnetic spectrum, the UVA are not as powerful, so they've never provoked much of a problem in humans or other animals. But now that more UVB is getting through, we're seeing an increased rate of skin cancers, and a fear is that eventually even more UVCs would come through. Already down in the southern continents, the southernmost parts of the southern continents, so we're talking about Patagonia, we're talking about maybe South Africa, although that one's a little bit higher up, in Australia, you have issues with children needing to wear hats and sunscreen to every recess, even if it's a 30-minute recess at school. You have animals that get cataracts and eventually go blind. So we are seeing a lot of effects from that decreased layer. Temperature is not one of them. Loss of biodiversity. This is something that we ended the semester with, and so we talked about habitat destruction and the rest of HIPCO. So remember your HIPPCO. H, the main reason for loss of biodiversity is habitat destruction, leads to a loss of many species. Usually we start with the plants. Obviously, if you're destroying habitat, you're chopping those down. It's not like you go in and deliberately kill the animals, but once the plants are gone, then the animals have no habitat, and then they're going to be forced to adapt, move, or die. Some species are better suited to adapting to human population, like raccoons and possums, and some simply aren't, like wolves or bears. The exact number of species we have is unknown, and therefore so is the exact number of species lost. But we do know that strong ecosystems need biodiversity. Just like the gene pool needs diversity, that's called genetic biodiversity, we need organism or species level biodiversity to have a strong ecosystem as well. That way, if one of our rivets were to pop out of our airship Earth, we would still be able to fill that void with another species. And so biodiversity is really the nuts and bolts that hold the whole thing together. From 1959 to 1980, 25% of all prescription drugs came from natural resources. Now we have shifted lately to working with more fabricated drugs, but think about the fact that the source for that information is typically still found in the natural and living world. Wild species are also valuable because they keep domestic species vigorous. I don't want you to think about this like wolves and chihuahuas. I want you to think about this like crops, because a lot of our domesticated species are actually plants. And what that means is that we have bred them and we have selected for the best types of corn. We have bred and selected for the most robust tomatoes. And so when we have the wild cultivars, when we have the wild species, we're able to always add in a little bit of genetic diversity when that species faces a problem. We don't want something to happen like the Irish potato famine, where one thing comes in, one fungus comes in and wipes out everything that we have. And then the other reason why people appreciate biodiversity is simply aesthetics. Now, going up to the top, I talked about HIPCO, told you H was for habitat destruction. You need to know what the rest of HIPCO stands for. I've been surprised the last couple of days. Do not remember what the C or even the O would be. Make sure you know your HIPCO. Okay, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson is really credited as the mother of environmental science. She was a marine biologist. A lot of people forget that. She was very published before she wrote Silent Spring. Most of her works were about the ocean, and she grew up, or went to school rather, in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, which is still a world-renowned marine biology school. And so she did her research there. But she noticed this issue with the bird population, and she linked it up to the growing use of pesticides, especially DDT. And so once she had done that, she wrote this book, Silent Spring, and it was easily accessible to people who were not scientists. People read it, people became very alarmed, and it changed forever what we felt about what we were doing to the environment. Starting after Silent Spring, you get more people that are starting to write for the field of environmental science. In the 1970s, things have hit such a turning point that you have Earth Day, you have Richard Nixon signing legislation creating the EPA, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. All of these things are as a result of a more informed public, and part of that has to do with Rachel Carson. The original users of the pesticides didn't know that they were going to be accumulating in the living things and killing them as well. It was a very effective pesticide, but again, we didn't realize that it would not leave the body of an organism who was exposed to it. And that's what happened. That is bioaccumulation. Remember, the difference between bioaccumulation and biomagnification is that accumulation is inside of you personally. Biomagnification goes up into the food chain. So if I eat a lot of tuna, I am bioaccumulating tuna in my body. But because I am eating tuna, I have biomagnified the amount of mercury from one tuna, and now it is all sitting magnified in me. More cool environmentalists that you should know about. John Muir, founder of the Sierra Club, a very, very prominent preservationist, was friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and so he did have an ear of the president, which got some things protected, which was, again, a good thing, but he could never convince either Roosevelt or his cronies like Pinchot to stop messing with nature for other purposes. And the most famous of those we didn't have you guys read about, but it's an interesting story, is the Hetch Hetchy Dam, and that was built in Yosemite. And John Muir protested it, and he did not want it because it would change forever the scenery, it would change forever the flow of the water. But it was deemed necessary, and so it was done. Ansel Adams, you probably have seen his photography, he's very famous for inspiring people to want to appreciate nature and its aesthetic beauty. Some of his pictures are of alarming subjects, a barren tree or a desert field, but it's the beauty that you can see through his work that really leads people to understand the value of nature from that perspective. A lot of his work was done in Yosemite, so he's around the same area as John Muir. Aldo Leopold, after he had retired, wrote the book The Sand County Almanac, and that is important because we get the land ethic from it. The land ethic, remember, basically is the golden rule, but applied to our soils. He says if we want the land to treat us right, we must also treat the land well. And this is after the Dust Bowl, but this is before anybody is thinking about a connection to nature. Of course, we're upset by the Dust Bowl, but nobody's thinking that we are part of nature. Everybody is still thinking that we are above. And so Aldo Leopold really starts off then the idea of ecology, those interconnections. Henry David Thoreau, I think, gets a little bit more press than he deserves because as far as the scientific movement, not much going on as far as his contributions. But his book about living at Walden did get a lot of publicity. He's a very famous author, very good author, and one of your American classics that you've got to read for all of your classes. So the benefit here about Walden is he talks specifically about what it means to be connected to nature. So it's taking Aldo Leopold's idea, but this is again before Leopold, but it's taking that same idea and making it available to the public. So Walden is continually read in college classes for environmental science because of that. Famous American writer showing us that we need to be connected. And then Garrett Harding comes in after Rachel Carson and writes The Tragedy of the Commons. He focused on rangelands. He focused on the areas where cows were overgrazing. And so he saw in the American West, it's interesting how many of these guys are out west, but he saw in the American West how the overgrazing led to people not taking care of those range lands. And once the grasses get overclipped, they don't grow back. Grasses actually have to be cut. And so we have a grasslands in the United States that co-evolved with a bison herd that was continually moving through, grazing, and moving on. And what that meant is that our grasses actually grow better when they're cut down a certain length. But once you get too far down and closer to the root base, that will destroy the plant and it will start to get damaged. So Garrett Harding was looking at that though from the standpoint of it's every man for himself typically whenever we have a shared space, and that's not going to work in the long run. Okay, chapter 2 looked at ecosystems. Specifically, this is, I believe, chapter 3 in our book, however. Specifically, we want to focus on everything that is ecology-based. Now, we really do start down with atoms, even before atoms in physics class. Once we get to atoms, we're talking about chemistry, and then we go into cells, and that transition and moving on is biology. Biology works with cells and organisms, but that's where biology leaves off. Ecologists really want to know how those organisms interact with one another. That's a population. Populations are groups of the same species. And then the next thing we want to know is, okay, well, how do they interact with their community? And that would be the other living things around them. So population is one species, communities is multiple species. We go up one more level to ecosystems, and now we're including the biotic and the abiotic factors. So what kind of pH do trouts prefer, and what kind of dissolved oxygen do they need? So ecosystems is an even bigger look at an area. Then we move up one more level, and we're talking about the whole ecosphere or biosphere, the entire Earth. That is the realm of ecology, from populations up to the biosphere. After that, things turn back over to physics again, and we go out towards the universe and astronomy. So looking at ecosystems, we know we've got different types of biomes. Those are not covered in this PowerPoint. You'll have to look at those through a different method. But ecosystems are plants and animals that interact with their non-living or abiotic environment. And again, we do exist in biomes. Those biomes are determined primarily by climate and soil. The climate, remember, is primarily temperature and precipitation. Those are the biggest things that are going to determine a biome. But a climate is the average conditions over time, over a long period of time. We're talking decades and even hundreds of years, even centuries. Whereas weather is your daily variations. Remember, Mark Twain's quote is, "Climate is what we expect, weather is what we get." So that's how we distribute our biomes. Now, there's also some microclimate adjustments that you need to keep in mind. For example, light intensity. Different areas maybe don't get enough rain, but don't get enough rain, and so they might be called a desert. But if they're at a different latitude, it's going to change things dramatically. You might have a cold desert versus a tropical desert. And so light intensity does have some play into that. Soil type is a big deal because soil type is going to determine your vegetation, and vegetation is ultimately where we start making distinctions among the biomes. And the last thing to keep in mind is topography. Mountain ranges or mountains in general, are notorious for having their own microclimates. You could have a mountain located inside of a tropical rainforest, but as you climb up the mountain, you're going to see the same types of changes you would have seen if you went from the equator to the North Pole. You're going to see those same transitional stages as the temperatures get colder and the soil changes its quality. Trophic relationships. This is looking at our food chains and more specifically our food webs. And so looking at this energy pyramid, you can see our first trophic level is at the bottom, and that's our producers. They're getting energy from the sun primarily. We do have some chemosynthesis organisms, but for the large part, we've got producers at the bottom who are doing photosynthesis. That's first tertiary level. Second tertiary level is the primary consumer, or we would call that the herbivore. Next level up is our secondary consumer. It's the third trophic level, and it is also going to have to be a carnivore. And then on top of that, this example would be our fourth trophic level. He is a shark. He is what we would call a tertiary consumer because he is above even the second. Now remember that food chains, food webs do not get much bigger than 4 links. And the reason is energy is lost with each step up the food chain. You can even think about people. We are typically either eating vegetables and plant matter, even if it's something like rice, carbohydrates, they're coming from down here, or we're eating the primary consumers, cows, chicken, shrimp. Again, not a whole lot of times do we go past this. So usually here at a third trophic level, secondary consumer level. There are occasions when we might even go up one more if you ate, for example, a shark. But we also know that the further up the food chain we eat, the more energy was required to provide your diet, and if we're talking about seafood especially, the more pollutants you're going to be exposed to because of bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Okay, biomass and biomass pyramids. So we can make those pyramids with biomass, we can make them with energy, we can make them with trophic levels, we can make them with numbers. You have way more producers than you have herbivores, you have more herbivores than you have secondary consumers, and so on. So we also, by nature, have more biomass from those bottom layers, and biomass is the dry weight. If we had taken everything, dried it out in an oven, and gotten rid of all the water, we would have the biomass number. So we do know that biomass decreases as you go up in trophic levels. Only 10% of the energy from one trophic level moves to the next. And that's why it's so important that we have plants and that we have good crops, is it takes a lot of energy to pass that up. And the closer you eat to the bottom of the food chain, the less stress you're putting on the earth because you're losing less energy. Again, energy is not ever lost, it just converts to a lesser form. Energy released is high potential energy molecules like glucose, and then it's converted to low potential energy molecules like carbon dioxide. So again, that energy isn't created or destroyed, but instead it's just changed its form. The concept of eating lower on the biomass pyramid is exactly what I just said, that if we eat lower, then we actually are saving the earth some of the stress of producing for us. So by eating a cow, you're having to take in a lot more need for producers than if you had just gone ahead and eaten the lettuce So that's what they're looking at there. Relationships. We have mutualism, like the relationship between flowers and insects. With mutualism, you have a benefit. And so the flower has the aid in its reproduction process, and the insect is able to collect pollen, or in the case of something like a butterfly, it's able to collect nectar, and that's either going to be a food source for it or it's going to be used to create a food source. Commensalism is where one animal benefits and the other is neither hurt nor harmed. An example of this would be a bromeliad, like an orchid that grows in a tree in the rainforest. It doesn't root in the tree, it never puts any pressures on the tree. The tree doesn't know it even exists. It simply sits in a opening in some sort of hollowed out area or in the branch of a tree, and it absorbs its nutrients from what it considers a better place. Not that it can consider anything, but from a better place in the standpoint of preservation. Predator-prey relationships. In these, one is helped and the other is dead. Different from host-parasite, where one is helped and the other is strung along sickly. So they are kind of similar in that matter. You guys know what predator-prey is. Host-parasite, remember though, that the parasite wants to keep the host alive as long as possible because that's become its source of food, that's become its habitat, that's become its niche. It is everything for that parasite to keep you alive. Competition. There are two types of competition that you should know about. There's interspecific and intraspecific. Interspecific competition occurs between two or more different species, and intra, with an A, intraspecific competition is just within the single species. Both have their benefits. In intraspecific competition, you have, let's say, two male silverbacks that compete for a tribe of females. Well, what we know from Darwin and his the people that came after, we know that that encourages a better genetic flow because we have survival of the fittest. Fittest isn't always the strongest, could be the smartest, could be the best provider, but that competition is going to allow for the best genes to be spread. Now, if things become too inbred, then that individual will no longer be able to compete and somebody else will come in and take his place. The other type of competition is interspecific, where you have two or more species competing for the same thing. I always like to remember the Lion King, and you have the hyenas and the lions. And so there was competition for their resources, and that's sort of what the whole movie starts to be based about with Scar and his issues. But remember that when that's the case, Gauss's principle applies, or the principle of exclusion, that no two species can occupy the same niche for very long. The end result is adapt, move, or die. Habitat versus niche, easy stuff. Habitat's where you live, and niche is what your job is, what's your role for that ecosystem. When we talk about the places where organisms live, there are limiting factors that will help determine where it is. Temperature, light, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and precipitation can be some of those limiting factors. Each organism has optimum levels, and that's where it wants to be. Maybe your optimum temperature is colder than here and you want to move up north to New York or to Michigan, something like that. Personally, my optimum level is definitely going to be south of the Mason-Dixon. I cannot stand it when it gets cold. If I could live in Florida, California, that would be my ideal. It's my optimum level. Zones of stress are where you start to feel the impacts of not being optimal. So, for example, in the winter, I shiver. I feel like my body is not very happy in the winter. Then you reach the limits of tolerance. If it goes past that, it's just painful and you feel like you cannot survive, and that determines your range of tolerance. So for animals, this is a little bit more severe than for us because they don't have the options of putting on clothes and such. But if you have a preferred level of oxygen for trout, they'll flourish when they are at optimum levels. When the dissolved oxygen starts to fall, they will become stressed, which might mean they reproduce less. It might lead to decrease in population size. But once they reach the limit for tolerance, those fish are actually going to die. and that's going to show us the range of tolerance. When we did our bio column, or eco column, we had you taking measurements of all sorts of water conditions because we wanted to make sure that they stayed inside of our range of tolerance. Now, we can also get what's called synergistic effects, where two or more things together produce an outcome that's greater than the sum of the parts. And the example I always give for this is from toxicology, is that if smoking takes off 10 years of your life, and if asbestos exposure takes off 10 years of your life, then you would expect that a 10 plus 10 would give you 20. But what we have found out is that through synergistic interaction, it actually takes off 30. Again, that's synergistic effects. Okay, now a little bit about ecosystems and how they work. And I've already talked about the fact that Gauss's principle says that you either have to adapt, move, or die. And well, now we see this concept recycle or die. And that is how an ecosystem works. All matter has to be cycled because we know from chemistry that the law of conservation of matter says nothing is created and nothing is destroyed. So if we want food and food can't be created, we have to put the nutrients back into the soil so that they can be taken up again and recycled. So all matter is recycled, and the three venues we want to talk about are the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. The lithosphere, remember, is the crust and just a little bit beneath the crust into the mantle where we've got the asthenosphere. That's the part that we interact with. We don't go lower than that. We don't interact with any lower than that. And what's more important is our matter does not cycle through any more than that. Yeah, we can have magma pushed down, but eventually it will come back up and be part of our asthenosphere and then into the upper mantle. The hydrosphere is all of our water, the atmosphere, all of our air. Again, nothing created or destroyed. So all stable ecosystems recycle matter and get their energy from the sun. And this is ultimately where Miller, the author of your book, says that we are hugely wrong, is that our society does not recycle and that we choose to get our energy from a source other than the sun. Now, fossil fuels are indirect sun, but if we could look for the sun for the source of all of our energy, then we would be truly sustainable. If we recycled all of our matter, if we composted, if we were able to take all of our plastics and non-biodegradables and turn them back into products, then we would have a stable ecosystem with plenty of resources for years and years to come. Okay, a little bit from physics that applies to our ecosystems. We didn't talk about this specifically, but do remember from chemistry class that a calorie is a unit of energy. A calorie is the amount of heat needed to raise a gram of water 1 degree Celsius. A kilocalorie is 1,000 calories. And that's what you'll see on your food packaging is actually kilocalories. The big C instead of the little c means kilocalorie. So with that said, I don't think there's really much need for you to remember that. If they needed you to do a conversion on calories, they would give you enough information. But remember that we talked with food chains about the first law of thermodynamics and the second law. The first law says energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can, though, change forms. So it can go from sunlight to chemical energy through photosynthesis, and then it can become potential energy when you eat an apple, and then it can become kinetic energy when you do work. The second law of thermodynamics tells us that every time one of those transformations occurs, that there is disorder, and that disorder or entropy is really being we say loss of heat, but again, it's not lost, being the degradation of energy to a lower level. Typically, that's going to be heat. So in your popcorn lab, we had the question, where did the lost popcorn go? It was transformed into heat. It wasn't lost to the entire system as far as the biosphere, but it was lost to that individual and to that food chain. Okay, a little bit of chemistry. Atoms are the basic unit of matter. Chemical bonds hold atoms together. Molecular compound is when you have two or more atoms bonded together. And the pH scale came up a lot, came up in soil, and it came out in water quality. But the pH scale is measuring the hydrogen ion concentration, whether you're an acid or a base. I like to do it the other way because it helps you remember that the pH scale is in alphabetical order. Acids before base. So acids are 0 up to 7, and then past 7 is going to be your base, 7 being completely neutral. Okay, organic compounds. The only thing I really want you to remember about organic compounds is that they're going to be carbon-based. And so they talk about either being carbon-carbon bonds or carbon-hydrogen bonds. Do remember that they can be natural or they can be man-made. We are natural human beings. We know that we eat things with carbon chains like carbohydrates. So you can have natural organic compounds. That makes sense. It sounds like they would be. But you can also have man-made organic compounds if you're putting the right things together in the right order. And so again, anytime you've got those CC or CH bombs, or bonds, not bombs. Photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is how the sun's energy is transformed into energy that becomes usable in the food chain, but it's not very efficient. Only about 1% of the energy is used up. Chlorophyll is the mechanism that absorbs the light to drive photosynthesis. Plants are going to get from photosynthesis that glucose, and then they'll use glucose to construct other molecules. Basically, that would be to grow, to build their cell walls, to become stronger, to store energy, and as a source of energy. Okay, so on to cycling. We know that all matter has to be recycled, and the carbon cycle is one of the ways that this happens. We did not play the carbon cycle game. Sorry, we've done it before. It's kind of lame. Photosynthesis, again, is what's going to be at the forefront of carbon cycling as well as getting our energy. So carbon cycle through photosynthesis. Remember, the plants are taking in carbon dioxide so that they can produce the glucose for us. So carbon cycle, the major way that we move carbon out of the atmosphere is through photosynthesis. Oh, the thing that we've been doing mostly to move carbon back into the atmosphere is taking out fossil fuels and then burning them. And so those carbon-based fuels do become CO2 when they oxidize during the burning process, and that's a major component of what we now call global climate change. The nitrogen cycle. Remember that nitrogen is the main molecule in the atmosphere, and the reserve for the nitrogen, which means the place where most of it is held, is the atmosphere. So if you want to find nitrogen, go to the sky. Living things have to get nitrogen. It's part of our amino acids and proteins, and it's part of the building blocks for our DNA. So we have to have nitrogen, and we can get it from eating plants. Plants can get it from either ammonium or nitrate. Again, it's really easy to remember this if you remember the ate part, ATE. So to eat, plants have to have ate. To eat, they have to have nitrate. The nitrogen from the atmosphere is not in the right form, because remember, nitrogen in the atmosphere is N2 molecularly. So it has to be changed into either ammonium or nitrate. And the ways that that can happen, number one, rhizobium. Rhizobium are these little bacteria on the roots of beans. And I'll come back to this in a second. You can have industrial, which is production of fertilizers, and you can have lightning. Those are really the massive ways. Burning fossil fuels will produce some nitric oxides, but typically those aren't going to be taken up by the plants either. So I don't want you to think that, oh, burning fossil fuels is great because it feeds the plants. Not so. It does way more harm than good. Now back to those rhizobium, and this is an interesting point that's going to come up in the next chart. Remember that rhizobiums are helping to make nitrate, and that they're on the roots of legumes, which are beans. Okay, for the phosphorus cycle, it's important to remember that there's no gas phase, only solid and liquid. So phosphorus is found in rocks, or it's found dissolved in the water. We have to add phosphorus to fertilizers because for plants, it's one of their limiting nutrients. And so if they run out of phosphorus, they're simply not going to grow, not going to produce the fruits or the foods that we need from them. So we do add to fertilizers, we do add organic phosphates. But again, it's a limiting factor. So as soon as that fertilizer runs off into an aquatic system, it produces eutrophication. And that eutrophication is an excess growth of algae. Eventually, remember, eutrophication is going to lead to fish death. So if you need to go back and look up what your eutrophication process is, that would be a good thing to do. The rainforest is very good at recycling phosphorus, except when we cut the rainforest down. If we cut the rainforest down, then there is no cycling going on, and any phosphorus is going to go straight into the water supply through erosion forces. And so what we have here is a chart that looks at the three major cycles. Remember, these are not all the cycles. If you want to look at more of them, go to Miss Settle's lecture that she did on all of the cycles. But we've got carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Great little chart because it shows us the main non-living reservoir, atmosphere for both carbon and nitrogen, but the lithosphere for phosphorus. Remember, it cannot exist as a gas. Main living reservoir, we see carbohydrates. So again, we've got our glucoses that we need in order to get carbon into our bodies. For nitrogen, it's proteins. So again, I want you to go back and remember what I told you, that rhizobium are on the roots of legumes, which are beans. Now, if you've ever talked to anybody who knows anything about nutrition, they will tell you that beans contain an enormous amount of protein. So think about it. Beans are good at producing nitrogen from their roots, and beans are high in protein. There are very many plants that are very high in protein because they are converting it directly from the soil. So remember that. Plants are actually high in protein, higher than most people think they are, and that's how vegetarians can exist. Phosphorus is needed in your DNA, your ATP, your phospholipids, and so we know that those are incredibly important as well. So we have to get all of these elements from eating if we can't get them directly. So again, that cycling of matter. We can't make our own glucose, so we have to eat plants. We can't make our own proteins, or sorry, our own nitrogen, and so we're going to take in the proteins from other organisms. But you get the idea. Other non-living reservoirs, these are other places where you would find that chemical, that molecule. And then the human-induced problems. These are definitely things that you want to remember. These are in your textbook. Each of your cycles has a picture, and it's got the human interferences labeled, and it's got all of the rest of the parts to the cycle labeled. But with carbon, remember that it's climate change because we are burning the fossil fuels. We're also cutting down the trees, which would have absorbed the carbon dioxide. With the nitrogen cycle and the phosphorus cycle, huge problems from eutrophication, from fertilizers. And let's see, with phosphorus also you've got the cutting down of the rainforest, stops that recycling process for phosphorus. In Chapter 4, we look at population and succession. The top 6 most abundant elements in living things, again, not in any order, are what we call chnops. C is for carbon, H hydrogen, N nitrogen, O oxygen, P phosphorus, and S sulfur. Those are in living things. And so you know we've already talked about how we're going to get our carbon, how we're going to get our nitrogen and our phosphorus. Well, we also get our H2O, that's our water. And we need sulfur in our diet as well, but in trace amounts. It's not nearly as big of an issue for us, but that's why we want to learn the sulfur cycle. So again, go back to your textbook, go back to some of those other lectures. The top 8 elements in the Earth's crust. Now, if we look at these, we're going to see some of our micronutrients. That carbohydrate, protein, and lipid that we saw above, that we get from the C, the N, and the P, those are our macronutrients. But our micronutrients are those minerals that we need, the vitamins that we need. And we see we've got down there, and these are listed out as the things in the Earth's crust. So there is oxygen. Again, remember, soil has an immense amount of air in it. But a lot of what's in the soil is coming from the cycling of living matter, but we've got some of the minerals that are broken down by rocks too, and those are really where your micronutrients are. So skipping over the oxygen, you've got silicon, aluminum, iron, calcium, sodium, phosphorus again, and magnesium. and you've probably heard all of those listed out in dietary forms, maybe except for the aluminum. Silicon is getting a lot more press lately because it's very good for your hair, your nails, and your skin. Magnesium is necessary for healthy bones, as is calcium. Sodium is necessary for thyroid function, and iron is necessary for your blood. And so all of those things are micronutrients that we have to get as well. And if the Earth's crust becomes depleted of them, the plants become depleted and we become depleted. Moving on, we did eco-columns to try to mimic some of these procedures in nature, but in the real world, they attempted to make a living biosphere out in Arizona. And the reason was, like I said, it was very difficult to do a controlled experiment in the natural world. We can't control the weather, we can't control anything. And so they wanted, with this biosphere, they wanted to have control of everything. They wanted to create all the different biomes. There's even a lake in there that has a tidal current. So they've got aquaculture, they've got crops growing in a grassland, they've got a tropical rainforest with fruits growing. It's an amazing place. I've been there before. 5 acres, 4,000 species, and then they put in 10 humans. The idea was lock them in for 2 years, and that was supposed to give us a good idea of if we could establish colonies on the moon. That's what one of the funders really wanted to find out. Now, the problem was that when they built the biosphere, they pretty much filled it up and started working right away. Well, it turns out that concrete takes years and years to finish its curing process. So it's absorbing oxygen and carbon dioxide. And while they thought that they had the right proportion of plants so that they wouldn't need to worry about getting excess oxygen, it turned out that the CO2, the oxygen was being taken in by the concrete, so is the CO2. So the plants start dying, the oxygen stops coming, and the people needed air. So this was a huge problem. There was also a scientist who got majorly injured and had to be air vac'd because she had cut off, I think, a finger. The other issue is that ants and cockroaches took over. Just like they'll come into your house and you have no idea how, they got into biosphere. So if this is supposed to be a secure facility that's like a moon base, how are ants and cockroaches getting in? There must be issues with human construction, even when we think that we're doing the best job possible. Fires and ecosystems. I want you guys to remember that fires are a good thing for ecosystems. They maintain the balance of species in the long run. It is part of succession, we'll talk about later. It's beneficial because it returns the nutrients to the soil, so again, talking about that cycling of matter. But we've avoided natural fires, and so what happened is we built up the leaf litter and created crown fires instead of the good natural surface fires. And those fires kill the entire tree. 1988 is when we learned our lesson, because in 1988 the fires in Yellowstone Park burned so much of their natural ecosystem that we thought the park was going to be destroyed forever. But turns out that all that happened was that the predominant white bark pine trees became replaced by huckleberries. And that wasn't a problem because the grizzlies were able to eat both. They're used to both being in their habitat. They've evolved with both, but it had become too much of a white bark pine habitat, again, because of fire suppression. So leading to the idea of succession, that over time species are going to change, especially when we have disturbances. Primary succession occurs where there were no living things before, like where you had cooled lava, maybe an abandoned parking lot, a glacier that's moved over, even a mudslide. Secondary succession is where you start with soil, and that's always what I've reminded my students. Secondary starts with soil. So in secondary succession, you might have had a fire, you might have had a flood, but you do have a base there of soil to begin with, and that soil is important because it contains seeds and organic matter to start life. So you start out at a much better place with secondary. You can immediately have tree regrowth. You can immediately have all of your species come back. Aquatic ecosystems also undergo succession. Basically, over time, they're going to have silt and organic matter built up so that eventually they fill in. So as things die and decompose, they go down to the bottom as there's stream runoff. All of that sediment builds up and up. Your lake gets shallower. It pushes out your aquatic species as they start to die, as it starts to get hotter, as the oxygen levels fall. But what you'll see is that the terrestrial biome will start to move in from the shores and proceed on. A climax ecosystem is one that is in balance when there is not a major interference. A desert is a climax ecosystem. I'm trying to think of other good ones. A pine forest is a climax ecosystem. Again, primary succession is going to take longer because you don't have that soil base. And so the first things that come in have to be able to live on rocks and help to create that soil. And so you start out with lichen, moss, and microbes. And you can see from this picture, I didn't take it, but you can see the glaciers here in the background. And so the assumption I have is that this land was exposed by a receding glacier. So you can see just how rocky it is. Okay, so main topics: energy flow in the biomass pyramid, population dynamics, biotic potential versus environmental resistance. That's a huge figure. Figure is going to be different in our book. I think it's going to be in chapter 5, but that's where you look at your carrying capacity, limiting factors, all of that's going to be in that figure. Population equilibrium, introduced species and their effects on ecosystems. All of those will be in different figures in your book, but they're all huge topics to consider. And that's the end of this first section.